And now here we are way up in the clock tower, the crowning glory of any courthouse, 205 feet tall. Remember our young architect, Max Orlopp? He was young indeed. It's a beautiful tower, the original one was, but by 1919 they were pretty sure it was going to collapse and kill everybody in the courthouse, so they had to take it down. Structural engineering he just hadn't mastered yet in 1892. However, our very generous county, with the help of a lot of supporters, was able to rebuild it, and so it now once again graces the top of Old Red. And it has the same type of 9-foot-tall clock faces facing 4 directions. That would have been important in 1892 because not many people could afford a watch. So the clock at the top of the courthouse would have been how they kept track of time. Where the clock works, naturally the original ones were lost long ago. But these are from the E. Edwards Company, and it's a rebuilt Victorian model. Victorian mechanics always were beautifully painted, had lots of brass, and all sorts of intricate pieces that worked together almost like magic, and that's exactly what we have up here. Our next speaker, Ralph Cousins, is a Dallas native, and he has earned degrees in American history, international administration, and political philosophy. He was reading for his humanities PhD qualifying exam at the University of Texas at Dallas when cancer prompted him to withdraw. He taught in the University of Dallas Graduate School of Management for 10 years. He's retired after a career in fund development and management of not-for-profit corporations. Today he will be discussing an incident that took place right here at the Old Red Courthouse. His topic is Ejected from Old Red, Black Jury Service in the Time of Jim Crow.
Thank you, Evelyn, and thank you to the sponsors of the Legacies Conference in this difficult year. Jim Crow was an unremitting menace that perched on every black man's shoulder, from daily humiliations to major outrages and lynchings. Fear of overstepping a boundary was ever present. 3 blacks were lynched in Texas in 1936. In 1930, a black man in Sherman was accused of raping an unidentified white woman. The accused was burned to death when white rioters torched the courthouse. Through discriminatory ordinances and statutes called the Black Codes, Jim Crow was alive and well in the years between the world wars. The dominant white culture blocked or discouraged blacks from exercising the most basic constitutional rights. Social actions between blacks and whites were regulated by ordinance or by custom. George Porter was a slight, bespectacled black man. In 1938, the educator was the president of the Dallas satellite for Wiley College. It promised to be a clear, hot September day. Mr. Porter tied his tie, put on his vest, brushed his suit jacket. He was on his way to the courthouse. Dallas County had called him to jury duty. On 2 previous occasions, Porter had responded to jury duty. In 1921, he served 1 day after whites threatened to lynch him. In 1936, he also served 1 day after allowing himself to be dismissed after protesting. He didn't believe that today would be any different. Like Porter, the Reverend Ernest Estelle and Dr. B.E. Howell also lived on Thomas Avenue in the State Thomas neighborhood north of Dallas, downtown Dallas. Estelle, Howard, and Charles Graggs, who would meet them later, volunteered to be witnesses to the day's events. Estelle and Howell would join Porter soon to ride the streetcar to the courthouse. Born in Savannah, Georgia in 1877, George Porter was the last of 7 children. His father, James Ward Porter, was freeborn, his mother having purchased her freedom. George learned his passion for equality and fairness at an early age. James, his father, was an African Methodist Episcopal pastor. Even before the Civil War and emancipation, Porter strove for freedom. James established a music school for black children in Savannah and openly offered lessons in violin, voice, and piano. He clandestinely taught reading and writing. Teaching blacks to read was illegal in Georgia. James was one of 20 black religious leaders who met with Major General William Tecumseh Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in January 1865 to discuss matters related to the freedmen of the state of Georgia. Additionally, he was a representative in the first Reconstruction Georgia legislature that heard after the first quorum call, you are required to duly ratify the amendments to the Constitution proposed in the 39th Congress, known as Article 14. A colleague in the legislature was the influential AME Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. Throughout his life, George Francis Porter, James's son, continued his father's struggle. In 1917, while still new to Dallas, Porter demonstrated his willingness to challenge white dominance. He taught English at the colored high school at the corner of Hall and Cochran Streets, just a few blocks from his house on Thomas Avenue. Porter resigned his teaching job as superintendent. Justin Ford Kimball refused to equalize pay among all black teachers, male and female. Kimball said that would be social equality. The phrase social equality was a fire bell for racists. Porter quickly replied that it would not matter since colored teachers would receive equal pay. Kimball offered Porter a higher secret salary if he would not press the issue. He resigned. Porter was an 1899 honor graduate of Atlanta University. A professor at Atlanta University at that time was W.E.B. Du Bois, who had a profound impact on Porter. It's likely that Porter was one of Du Bois's research assistants as the professor was doing his groundbreaking work on race. Their correspondence continued well into the 1920s. In the spring of 1938, Walter White, National Secretary of the NAACP, gave a presentation at the Moreland YWCA, now the home of the Black Dallas Dance Theater, regarding the stalled anti-lynching legislation in Congress. During his brief stay, White likely briefed the Dallas leadership on the organization's strategy of using discrimination lawsuits to enforce civil rights laws. The NAACP national office was seeking incidents of flagrant discrimination that contained the elements of a good constitutional challenge. Many jurisdictions across the South simply ignored the Supreme Court's decisions. A series of U.S. Supreme Court cases, especially the Scottsboro Boys cases, called attention to the 14th Amendment's due process and equal protection clauses and the issue of jury service. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, known collectively as the Civil War Amendments, were designed to ensure equality for emancipated slaves. One of the Jim Crow customs that vexed blacks involved service in pettit juries and grand juries. The custom was that blacks seeking to exercise their rights would be called to jury service, excused by the presiding judge, collect their per diem stipend, and go home or go back to work. The NAACP in Dallas had had an up and down history. However, in 1938, it was active and busy. In fact, George Porter and Ammon Scott Wells had organized the first Dallas branch of the NAACP in 1918. Over the summer, Dr. B.E. Howell, president of the Dallas branch, encouraged by Walter White, developed a procedure for blacks to follow when summoned for jury service. He urged them not to disqualify themselves voluntarily. Observers would accompany the prospective black juror to serve as witnesses. However, both the prospect and the witness were at great risk. This is a photo of Mr. Porter sitting in the central jury room from the Dallas Morning News. George Porter arrived at the Dallas County Courthouse on Monday, September 26th, accompanied by Reverend Estelle and Dr. Howell. Charles Graggs met them there. The three friends, all respected in the community, were to act as witnesses as Porter declined to be excused and remained in the central jury room. Deputy Sheriff Fred Army, on duty in the courthouse, told Porter that Texas Jim Crow laws forbade blacks and whites from sitting together in public. Despite glares and mutterings from white men, Monday passed uneventfully. All the potential jurors were men. Women would not sit on juries in Texas until 1954. On Tuesday, Porter was back in the central jury room, ready to be added to a panel. The day progressed, and the tension increased. By flouting Jim Crow laws and custom, he was walking an exceptionally fine line. The thought of a black man sitting in judgment over a white person was objectionable to most whites. He was challenging the fundamental social structure of post-Reconstruction Texas. Although all legal authority and all social gravity focused on disenfranchising blacks and rendering them impotent, a slight, bespectacled, middle-aged black man was claiming that by the Constitution he had the right to be there and to be chosen for a jury. Not surprisingly, sporadic threats of harm continued through the day. As Porter took his seat Wednesday morning, the hostility was palpable. A front-page article in the morning paper could have been interpreted as calling for violence. It said, "Unless he is forcibly removed, Black College President G.F. Porter will serve the rest of the week." Enduring verbal assaults and threats, Porter remained sitting in a corner away from all others. Early in the afternoon, waiting alone for the proceedings to begin, two white men suddenly grabbed Porter by the collar and threw him down the north steps of the building. Porter called out to Deputy Sheriff Army, the court clerk, and other court officials to protect him. They refused. Within seconds, scores of whites, encouraging the cruelty, gathered in the hall, on the courthouse steps, and on Main Street below as Porter struggled to stand. He slowly dusted off and straightened his clothes, then pressed through the onlookers, climbed the steps, pushing through a crowd seeking to obstruct his entrance, entered the courthouse, and resumed his wait in the central jury room. Charles Graggs, Porter's friend and volunteer witness, was asked by a bystander, what was he doing? Graggs replied, "Porter was attempting to discharge his duty as a juror." The man then responded, "Not here in Dallas, Texas." Dallas civil rights activist Juanita Craft recalled that the attack on Porter was the trigger that prompted her to join the NAACP. After this incident, Porter's eyesight began to fail. 10 years later, he would be completely blind. While his neighbors and friends believe so, it is not certain if the incident that September day contributed to his blindness. Presiding District Court Payne Bush had two problems. This is a photograph of Judge Bush many years later from the Dallas Bar Directory. Exactly the problems that the NAACP wanted him to have. Out of his sense of duty, he did not order Porter out of the courthouse. If Bush dismissed Porter, and due to the violence, there would be controversy, embarrassment, and possibly censure for violating recent Supreme Court rulings and denying a citizen his right to vote. Judge Bush's second problem was that he was elected by the voters of Dallas County. More specifically, he was elected by the white voters of the county. Dallas Morning News columnist Lynn Landrum eloquently praised and summed up Bush's dilemma. Quote, "He knows that blacks have not only the right but also the duty to serve. But he also knows full well that the majority of white Democrats to whom he must look for renomination and re-election to the bench prefer not to have black jurors serve in the courthouse. He probably so prefers himself." End quote. Seeing a possible peaceful way out of the impasse, Bush sent Porter to Judge John Rawlins' court to sit on a voir dire panel, knowing that both attorneys would strike him from the jury. The court would then have allowed Porter to exercise his duty, and the injured Porter, having made his point, would save face and leave. Both attorneys did strike him. When asked a few moments later by Judge Rollins why he did not take his per diem and leave, Porter responded, "I'm here to insist on my constitutional rights, and these three gentlemen here are witnesses and observers to see what happens." At that time, jury service was a 5-day obligation. Thus, Porter returned to the jury room to wait and to be called again. Around the noon hour, prior to the attack, the judges of the Dallas County District Court met in Judge Bush's chambers. As told to reporters, the topic of discussion was scheduling of vacations. It is likely, however, that the actual topic was George Porter. Possibly aware of the pending violence, they agreed that Porter should, if he should again refuse to be dismissed, Judge Sarah T. Hughes would discuss the situation with him and, if necessary, sternly dismiss him. Porter did report to Judge Hughes. This is a photo of Judge Hughes, the first woman district judge in Texas in 1935 at her swearing in. I believe this photo was taken in the original Supreme Court room in the Texas Capitol. Dallas City Councilwoman Juanita Craft, remembering Porter in the jury episode, that said that when Judge Hughes told Porter he was dismissed, dirty and disheveled, he responded, "I'd rather not. I'm not in a hurry. I'd rather serve." Word of the attack on Porter traveled fast. The Associated Negro Press Association distributed the story nationwide. The story appeared in every black newspaper in the country. When the news of the attack reached New York, the national office of the NAACP, Walter White asked U.S. Justice Department to investigate. He also wrote a letter to Governor Allred of Texas requesting an investigation. Allred sent Texas Rangers to investigate. Allred had his finger in the national political wind. That July, just 3 months before the attack on George Porter, President Roosevelt announced from the back of a train in Wichita Falls, Allred's hometown, that he was appointing Allred to a newly created U.S. District Court position for the Southern District of Texas. Allred was a liberal who followed President Roosevelt's policies, but was simultaneously a Southern demagogue who, with implicit beliefs in white superiority that characterized most Southern politicians of that age. Facing his Senate confirmation in January, Allred wanted to go by the book. This is a picture of Walter White, the National Secretary for the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, and Roy Wilkins. Walter White and the NAACP wanted to do an independent investigation. Did the Porter incident have the requisite elements for a federal civil rights case? On October 8th, 10 days after the attack, a train brought NAACP Thurgood Marshall to Dallas to investigate. Before Marshall even left for Texas, he received word that he would be killed if he set foot in the state. Recently, Dallas Police Chief R.L. Bob Jones had told his top officers a black lawyer from New York is coming to stir up trouble. Thurgood Marshall related to National Public Radio journalist and biographer Juan Williams that the chief said, "I will personally take him out and kick the crap out of him." Personally. Marshall sent a letter to Governor Allred requesting protection. Dr. Tom Smith, former executive director of the Old Red Courthouse Museum, reported that in doing research for the museum, he interviewed A. Maceo Smith's widow, Fanny. He asked her about the George Porter incident. He asked Mrs. Smith if it was true that Thurgood Marshall had visited Governor Allred in Austin to request protection while in Dallas. Dr. Smith reported that Fanny Smith threw back her head in laughter and said, if Thurgood went to see Allred in Austin, he entered through the kitchen. Allred assigned a Texas Ranger to accompany Marshall while he was in Texas. This is a picture of Chief of Police Bob Jones. Marshall stayed in Dallas for 5 days. He met with Judge Bush and possibly Sarah Hughes, certainly George Porter and the leadership of the Dallas NAACP. In Juan Williams' biography, Marshall relates an incident that speaks to the reality of Jim Crow and his request for a bodyguard. One day, while leaving the courthouse, he was confronted by Chief of Police Jones with his pistol drawn. "Hi, you black SOB, I've got you," Marshall recalled. The Texas Ranger protecting Marshall, also with his gun drawn, stepped between Marshall and the sheriff, saying, "Fella, stay just where you are." Marshall, the Texas Ranger, with his gun still unholstered, got in the car and drove away. Shaken, Marshall returned to New York soon thereafter. 2 weeks after Porter was assaulted, William Ira Dixon, a shoemaker, sat in the central jury room for 3 days, seeking to serve on a jury. Despite glares from white jurors and muttered epithets, there was no violence. It's very possible that Thurgood Marshall was in the courthouse. The court's proper treatment of Dixon may have convinced Marshall that the Porter episode was not the civil rights suit the NAACP sought. By itself, the story of the assault on George Porter by two white thugs would be an interesting glimpse into Jim Crow Texas. However, the Porter incident came at a time when attitudes of courts and communities across the South were changing. The fight was not over. In 1940, with the contingent of black Dallas leaders invited by Walter White, Porter testified in Washington before a congressional committee in favor of the anti-lynching bill. This is a picture of Porter testifying to the congressional committee. This is a photo of that delegation returning from Washington. You can see the Union Station in the background. First row, second from left, is Charles Graggs. From the first row, fourth from left is Reverend Estelle. Sixth from left is George Porter. In the back row, fourth from left is Fred Jones. And on the far right end in the back row is Dr. Howell. Also in 1940, quite a stir in Dallas was created when Porter made formal application to fill the job of city manager during the absence of James W. Aston, who had been called for service in the Army Air Corps. Porter was not selected. There were other civil rights wins. Porter would work closely and share victories with NAAC National Office and Thurgood Marshall on several issues over the next 10 years. In his last years, now totally blind, Porter operated a newsstand at the State Theater on Thomas Avenue. Fred Jones stated in his poignant Dallas Express serial biography of Porter that 30 minutes before his death, his friend Charles Graggs brought Porter a pitcher of lemonade and soda bottles. He said, "Graggs, I'm depending upon you and Jones to help me with this race question." Porter died August 1951. He's buried in Dallas's Lincoln Memorial Park. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Pete Kurles, a native Dallasite. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt University and the University of Texas at Arlington. His interest in photographs as documentary evidence of events grew out of his work as the photographic archivist in the 1980s for the Dallas Public Library. He's a records and information management professional currently serving as the records management officer for the city of Dallas. Last year, he addressed our conference on Images of Disaster in Dallas, Texas. That was a really good one. Today, I'm sure he'll be equally good when he speaks about the man with 9 lives, Herbert the Cat Noble.
Who was Herbert Noble? He was born in 1909 and grew up in West Dallas, knowing the Barrows, the Hamiltons, and other West Dallas toughs. He remained in school until he was 16. He left school, becoming a truck driver for Sims Refinery. He got married in 1930, and in 1931 he had a daughter named Frida born. At some point, he and his wife and daughter moved to West Texas to work in the oil fields. He was mechanically adept and learned how to repair automobiles and airplanes. He also became a licensed commercial pilot. Upon returning to Dallas in 1938, he became the manager of the Santa Paula Hotel at 1710.5 Live Oak Street, where he served as a pit boss for Sam Murray's gambling games and Murray's bodyguard. From the 1920s to the mid-1940s, although illegal, Gambling was a well-established fixture in Dallas. Many of the games took place in hotels such as the St. George and Southland, with the gambling occurring in large suites. Millions of dollars changed hands weekly, whether craps, numbers, or policy wheels. Warren Diamond was the gambling czar of Dallas from the early 20s until his suicide in 1932. As a czar, he collected 25% from every other gambling operation in town. He was known as the biggest craps fader in town. A fader is somebody who covers other people's bets. One time, a man came into his game, threw down a thick envelope onto the table and says, "I'm going to make you look." Diamond said, "Give him the dice." The man rolled twice, crapped out, and left. Diamond picked up the envelope, opened it, and counted out 172 $1,000 bills. Lester Bennion, one of Diamond's co-workers, learned from that incident to never turn down a bet. In 1930, Diamond began the construction of a $65,000 mausoleum that would eventually hold him, his parents, and other family members. In 1932, Diamond was undergoing prostate cancer treatment at St. Paul's Sanitarium. He got up one day, left the room, and drove to his house at 4224 Armstrong Parkway, where he committed suicide. The mausoleum can be seen today at Grove Hill Cemetery. One thing, during the Depression, the city tax receipts dropped precipitously. The city fathers came up with a plan. They decided that each week, Dallas police would hit every gambling operation in town, and they would count heads. The next morning, the operators or their attorneys would go down to City Hall and pay a fine of $10 per head. This brought in anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000 a year to the city coffers. Thus began a symbiotic relationship between the gamblers such as Bennion, Noble, and Sam Murray, who all saw it as doing a cost of business. When Noble came back to Dallas in 1938, he went to work for Sam Murray at his hotel, where he served as a pit boss and also as Murray's bodyguard. Murray was not a pleasant person to live with, to put it mildly. Murray came to Dallas in the late 20s. He made a name for himself as a gambler, a bootlegger, and a bookmaker. By the mid-30s, he had seized control of the horse racing wire service. By 1938, Murray had acquired substantial political influence and started moving in on Bennion's numbers racket. After numerous warnings from Bennion, Murray rarely left his ranch, and if he did, he was accompanied by his bodyguard, Herbert Noble. On June 14, 1940, Murray and his wife left their ranch, headed to Dallas. Murray had business to do at Dallas National Bank, and his wife wanted to go shopping at Neiman Marcus. Bennion had received word that Murray was coming into town, so he and a cohort of his, Ivy Miller, left the Hotel Southland at 1200 Commerce Street and headed towards Dallas National Bank. Miller hid himself at the entrance to the bank, and when Murray came forward, Miller shot him, opened fire, hitting him in the stomach, fired 6 additional shots, hitting him in the leg, twice in the left side and on the back. 2 Dallas police officers happened to be driving along in their patrol car. They stopped, jumped out, and one assisted Murray, the other arrested Miller in the bank lobby. Bennion, meanwhile, turned and made his way back to the Southland Hotel, knowing his rival was eliminated. Murray died before reaching the hospital. Many suspected that Noble had dropped a dime on Murray. Noble took over Murray's operations. Bennion and Noble were polar opposites. Bennion was born in Pilot Point, Texas in 1904, left home at 15, working in El Paso and the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He worked cattle, traded horses, gambled, and bootlegged. He settled down in Dallas towards the end of World War I. He apprenticed himself to Warren Diamond. In 1926, he cut his ties and established his own craps game in room 226 of the Hotel Southland, which eventually became the headquarters for his gang, the Hotel Southland Gang. When Diamond committed suicide in 1932, Bennion became the king of Dallas gambling. He was basically illiterate, but he had a mind for gambling and mathematical odds. Doug Swanson described Bennion as a canny, shrewd, and pragmatic businessman, though he could barely read or write. He either controlled his rivals or had them killed. Noble was the antithesis of Bennion, suave, debonair, a licensed pilot, well-educated compared to Bennion. After the hit on Murray, Noble took control of Murray's games, established the Airmen's Club on Live Oak, as well as games in other locations. The two came to loggerheads in January 1946 when Bennion demanded that Noble pay not the normal 25%, but to pay 40%. Bennion believed that Noble was shorting him, and so he also demanded that one of Bennion's men be there to count the money. Of course, Noble adamantly refused, which Bennion didn't like, so began the war. Noble once told a reporter that Bennion's attack on his life were not motivated by gambling or money, but by pride. I won't bow down to him, and he hates me because it, Noble said. In 1946, a reform group had elected a new district attorney and county sheriff for Dallas. The group wanted to clean up Dallas, especially the gambling. Bennion saw the handwriting on the wall and left for Las Vegas at the end of 1946. On the night of January 15, 1946, Noble locked up the Airmen's Club, got in his car, and headed out to his ranch in what is now Flower Mound. Not far out of town, a car started following him and quickly drove up behind him. The occupants started firing at Noble, who fired back. The cars raced along at speeds of up to 90 miles an hour along country roads. About a mile from his ranch, Noble's Mercury skidded off the road and into a ditch. He scrambled out of the wreck and headed towards a farmhouse not too far away. The pursuers came to a stop. Two jumped out and started firing at Noble, one hitting him in the back just above his left hip. He was able to crawl under a farmhouse, and the owner of the farmhouse came out with his rifle and demanded to know what was going on. Noble's pursuers climbed back in their car and left. Noble ended up at Methodist Hospital. So Noble's ranch was named the Diamond M. It was in honor of his wife. It's located in what is now Flower Mound and had more than 800 acres of land. It has been variously described as either 4 miles northeast of Grapevine or 7 miles north of Grapevine. He had cattle, turkeys, guinea hens, and 2 tame deer. The ranch became his refuge. He built cabins on the property for private poker games. Noble would fly in gamblers to the ranch, landing on his private airstrip. Being out in the country, he knew when law enforcement would show up and the games could be shut down before the law showed. Following the murder of his wife, he installed floodlights on the house, which were kept on all night. He had several guard dogs spotted around the house to warn him of intruders. Noble became somewhat of an insomniac as attacks on him increased. He also became a heavy drinker. He would sleep with a carbine beside his bed for protection. On August 19, 1946, Noble and a compatriot, Jack Darby, headed towards Arthur Thomas's gambling establishment at Knox and Travis in North Dallas. They were going there to collect a $12,000 gambling debt. As Noble entered the building, Darby pulled a gun and started shooting at Noble's feet. Darby was disarmed, and it was said that Bennion had offered Darby a large money roll as well as a percentage of a downtown crap game if he would get rid of Noble. He didn't get rid of Noble, but Noble got his $12,000. Things calmed down for 2 years. Noble still ran his gambling operation at the Airmen's Club, but on the night of May 20th, 1948, he was ambushed as he drove across the cattle guard entrance to his ranch. His right arm was riddled with buckshot, but he was able to drive to the ranch house. He destroyed the cattle guard, as seen in this photograph, to prevent people from driving in at that entrance to the ranch. Almost a full year passed before there were any more attacks on Noble. On February 14th, 1949, a friend noticed a man fiddling with Noble's car outside the Airmen's Club. He ran inside, warned Noble. Noble called the police. Vice officers showed up, examined the car, and determined that dynamite had been put underneath the car. Nobody was ever found to who did it. On the night of September 7th, 1949, Jack Nesbitt and Jim Thomas attacked Noble near his ranch, shooting him in the leg. Nesbitt was arrested, but not indicted. Information had been received that these men had been hired by Benny Bennion. The next attack on November 29, 1949, was the most devastating and tragic attack. Noble had been trying to ease away from gambling. On the morning of November 29th, he was headed to Fort Worth with 2 New York bankers, where he and his partners would close on the purchase of Hicks Field, a former World War I and World War II military training field. He and his partners wanted to turn the field into a private airport with aircraft maintenance and repair services. The purchase allegedly would get him out of the gambling business, escape Bennion's enmity, and allow him to go legit. His wife Mildred was excited about the venture. She dreaded the thought of a late night phone call which would tell him that her husband had been murdered. She was not involved in his gambling pursuits. Instead, she strove to create a life like that of the city's merchant class. She had domestic help, she did luncheons, attended church committees, had a house in town, and a country retreat. Their daughter Frida attended a Virginia boarding school. Since Noble would be driving the bankers to Fort Worth, he decided to take Mildred's Cadillac instead of his Mercury. As he said, the Cadillac was a nice ride. He drove away from his house at 311 Conrad in the Beckleywood neighborhood of Oak Cliff and arriving in Fort Worth an hour later. About mid-morning, Mildred left the house, planning to go to the ranch and pick up their maid, who would help her prepare a celebratory dinner for that night. She got into the Mercury, pressed the starter, which ignited a dynamite nitroglycerin gel bomb hidden behind the dashboard. The explosion was heard over 8 miles away. A car door was flung over 2 rows of houses, landing in a backyard. Her body was flung from the car, landing in the front yard. A neighbor ran outside, saw it, went inside, called the police, and then covered the smoking, black and bloody body with a sheet. In Fort Worth, Noble had just completed signing the purchase papers when he was told he had a phone call. Picking up the receiver, he listened in silence and said, "Dead?" Putting down the receiver, he turned to the others saying, "The bastard killed my wife." Noble purchased a solid bronze 2-ton casket for his wife for a reported $15,000, said to be the most expensive one in Dallas. 700 people crammed themselves inside the funeral chapel at Lamar and Smith Funeral Home. Another 400 people waited outside. 11 pallbearers were needed to move the casket. 100 cars were in the funeral procession that went to what is now Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery. Retreating to his ranch after his wife's murder, Noble abandoned his Oak Cliff house. He installed footlights that remained on all night. He bought 6 Chihuahua dogs to serve as a warning system, yapping at any sounds that might be an intruder. He stayed up all night, armed with a rifle and unable to sleep, many times drinking. When morning came, he would get in his car and drive to the cemetery to visit his wife's grave. Wherever he drove, he kept a carbine next to him on the seat. On New Year's Eve, Noble was at his Oak Cliff home with his daughter when he decided to go to the drugstore. As he left the house at 9 p.m., he was bathed in the white light from a car's spotlight. Shots were fired. His left elbow was shattered by a round which went through his hip and lodged near his spine. He was able to crawl to his house where his daughter called for an ambulance. He refused to go to the ambulance until the police arrived and were able to escort him. 5 weeks after being shot, he was still recovering from his wounds in a private room at Methodist Hospital when about 11 p.m. on the night of February 6, 1950, a lone gunman standing in one of the hospital's courtyards took aim at a shadowy figure in a 4th floor room. Noble was just coming out of the bathroom when the gunman fired. The round missed him, lodging in the ceiling. Noble dropped to the floor, crawled to the wall socket, unplugged the lamp, turning the room dark. The gunman escaped. While driving to Dallas one night from his ranch on June 13, 1950, Noble was attacked by 3 punks that he had cursed out in West Dallas. Noble's car, as you can see, was riddled with bullets. As you can see, watch what you say. Noble owned several airplanes. He used the planes to review the ranch and see what work needed to be done. He would fly in gamblers to play high-stakes poker games in cabins he built on the ranch. At one time, Noble, still upset over the death of his wife and believing that Bennion was responsible, decided he would use his Beech Stagger Wing to bomb Bennion's Las Vegas house. He attached hard points to the wings underneath, one for a high explosive bomb, the other for napalm. He would fly to a private strip in Arizona where he would refuel and then fly to Las Vegas. Fortunately, a friend of his who worked for the Dallas police came out to the ranch one day and saw him working on the plane. He asked what he was doing. Noble, surprised, broke down in tears, crying that Bennion got all the breaks. The officer was able to dispose of the bombs and nothing more was said. On January 10th, 1951, Noble went out to start up one of his planes and it wouldn't start. He and one of his ranch hands pulled the motor from the airplane and discovered that 2 cylinders were filled with 2 large chunks of nitroglycerin. In March, he climbed aboard his stagger wing and started the motor only to have it explode on him. The only thing that saved him was the steel firewall. For several days, neighbors had seen a blue pickup truck cruise up and down the dirt roads near Noble's house. No one took much notice of the 3 men. Then one night, the men returned. They began digging a hole near the base of Noble's mailbox. They filled that hole with dynamite, blasting caps, and nitroglycerin. They then connected the explosives with a wire to a Delco car battery buried near the mailbox. From there, they ran another wire to a hiding place 60 yards away. One drove the truck away and put it in hiding. 2 of the men stayed where they could watch the mailbox. It was 105 degrees. They waited for Noble to leave. As dawn broke, Noble got up and prepared to go to town. Sadly, he was still suffering from the loss of his wife. He had been drinking heavily over the years. He had become estranged from his daughter Frida, who married a young man that Noble disapproved of. Noble had written a new will, leaving her only $10 out of an estate worth $1 million, which included the Airmen's Club, the 800-acre ranch, 5 airplanes, and 195 head of cattle. About 11:30, he left the house, taking his carbine, $600 in cash, and his playing cards. Noble enjoyed checking his mail as he received lots of letters from around the country after each attempt on his life. He stopped the car right on top of the buried bomb. As he reached for his mailbox, the assassins touched a copper wire to the barbed wire, grounding the connection, causing the buried bomb to explode. The explosion created a hole that was 5 feet across and 4 feet deep. It tore the car apart, flipping it on its back. One of Noble's legs was flung towards the killer's hideout. The mailbox flew 75 feet. Noble's body was gone below his waist. Near the destroyed car lay some cash and 2 playing cards face up, a joker and the ace of diamonds. It was 90 minutes before George Cunningham, a neighbor headed home, arrived on the scene. He called law enforcement. Lawmen from several agencies arrived on the scene. In the middle photo, lined up from left to right, are Texas Ranger Lewis Rigler, the blind Denton County Sheriff W.O. Hodges, another deputy sheriff, and Deputy Sheriff Roy Baker. U.S. Postal inspectors were on the scene also, since a mailbox was destroyed. Investigators could find few clues beyond the battery and the wires that connected to the bomb. They took measurements, dusted for fingerprints, and drew maps. As Doug Swanson wrote, they could have put all the clues in a suitcase and had room left over for what remained of Noble. A Houston Press reporter called Noble in Las Vegas to inform him of Noble's death. Bennion said, "I'm glad he's dead." On August 9th, Herbert Noble was laid to rest at Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery next to his wife, Mildred. The cat had run out of lies. In the 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers created Lake Grapevine, which partially inundated Noble's ranch. Today, what is left of the ranch is home to multi-million-dollar homes, such as this one at 1213 Noble Way. Included on that property, as you can see, are 2 of the cabins where Noble held poker games. Thank you very much.
Let's all give a nice virtual round of applause for all of our speakers, each and every one of whom did a great job under somewhat challenging circumstances. All of us on the conference planning committee did our best to make this the best possible conference we could, given the limits of the times. And I wish that all of you could have joined us here at Old Red, because this is the last January when the history community of Dallas could have gathered at the Old Red Museum. We've been notified by the county that we're going to relocate. We're going to be moving to the school book depository, where we will share that building with the 6th floor museum. I don't know a lot of details yet, what part we'll be in. I don't even know what we're going to call ourselves, but I do know that I'm going to use this as an opportunity to give us an even brighter future, to even better fulfill our mission. Now, for today's conference, we have to make sure we thank all the people who were so helpful in pulling it off. Number one of whom would be Dealey Campbell. She embarrasses easily, so she wouldn't join me on camera, but she did so much of the work in making this come out. And we always thank Mike Hazel, the founder and continuing guide of both Legacies magazine and the Dallas History Conference. And I want to thank David Preziosi of Preservation Dallas, who is our main tech guy. He's also very tall for reaching things, so we found him very useful. We have many supporting institutions, and all of their leadership has done what they could to help us pull this conference off. And of course, we thank all of our patrons and all of our attendees for their continuing to support of our efforts. Next year, we hope to gather in person. Now, if you're wondering how on earth Pegasus is going to move over to the school book depository, he's going to fly, and I hope you'll let me ride him, just like on a dragon. I intend to enjoy that adventure, and perhaps you'll see us circling downtown.